to hedge laying for game and wildlife with the Northern School of Game and Wildlife at Newbury College. So in this little clip, what I'd like to talk to you about is environmental protection and hedge laying. So hedge laying itself can seem like quite a destructive activity in that we cut significant bits of habitat out and dispose of them, but at the end of the day, the main reason we lay hedges in the 21st century is to create wildlife habitat. So in terms of the hedge itself, we're aiming to let light to the ground layer, which allows grass and other agricultural non-useful species to develop, which provides habitat for ground nesting birds. We rejuvenate the hedge, so if it's beginning to get old and the liggers are beginning to rot and basically the hedge starts to fall back and decay and develop gaps, we can rejuvenate it to keep a good dense hedge bundle, which really helps our farmland birds with nesting sites and overwinter food sources in the form of nuts, berries and invertebrates. So one of the main things we have to think about with hedge laying is when it's done. Hedge laying is traditionally a winter activity. Normally, to make the plant survive, the hedge plant survive better, we would expect that the leaves have fallen off, which means that the sap has gone down inside the tree to stop it freezing and killing the living tissue, so that the hedge can survive the laying process better. So traditionally we carry out hedge laying from sort of November through to the end of February, very latest the start of March. Really, when the buds are starting to appear and break on the hedge plants, it's time to stop laying. That's also good for wild birds because we don't really want to be disturbing their nesting habitat during spring, and we also don't want to be taking their food source in the form of invertebrates away in summer via our hedge laying activity. So there are a few things we also need to think about in terms of environmental protection. One, before we start to clear the site to get access to the hedge, we should really be carrying out surveys of the flora and fauna in the area to make sure, one, there's no protected species of plants or animals using that area that we would disturb and therefore break the Wildlife and Countryside Act. We also need to look at the site as to access, because we should be aiming not to damage soil or any ground vegetation via the use of machinery or access by vehicles. The other things that we need to think of in terms of environmental protection are what we do with our arisings or brash. So traditionally, hedge brash is burnt fairly near the site, which in itself, if it's kept within the legal limits of a couple of tons of green brash per year, is acceptable. If you're taking any wood away to use as firewood, remember it must be dried until it's under 20% moisture. Or alternatively, if we have access to woodlands or any other sites where we can deposit the brash, why not think about building what's called a dead hedge, which is where we replicate the hedge laying process with the brash, but basically we knock stakes in and then we weave the brash in amongst it to create a hedge that is not alive, full of dead material, which then becomes a massive habitat for invertebrates and supports the woodland food chain. The other thing we can think of this in terms of for game birds is for our pheasant woods, this is pretty good cover for our pheasants. So if you're looking to improve your ground cover in a damp cold wood and you don't have permission to fell trees, you can pile this stuff in there to make ground cover for your birds. So moving away from the tree side of things, the other things that we will be generating if we're laying a maiden hedge like we've been doing on this site is tree guards. So we've got to be conscious about plastic in the landscape. We don't want to leave tree guards blowing about the countryside, so the best thing we can do with these is collect them up, stick them in a feed bag or whatever other instrument you've got to put them in, and then you can think about what you do with those tubes. really, if they're in good order, if you follow the order of sustainability, which is to reuse before recycling, if they're in good order, it's perfectly possible that you can use these tubes to re-establish more trees. If they're damaged, we then move down that order and we look at recycling and disposal via an approved waste contractor. One of the main tools nowadays for hedge laying is a chainsaw. It speeds the job up and saves the hedge layers back. So basically, one of the core issues we need to think about with chainsaws is the refueling point and the chain oil. On dry land, we want to try and keep the fuel and oil in the saw as much as possible, but if we spill a little bit, we probably aren't going to cause that much of an environmental issue. When we're working on wetlands or near water courses, we need to have serious thoughts about how much of this chain oil particularly we allow to enter the aquatic environment. Because what happens is if chain oil gets into water, it tends to create an oil film over the top of that water, which can stop the oxygenation process of the aquatic habitat. So if we are working near wetlands, we should really make sure that we are fueling on dry soil, or if that's not possible, we have a refueling bin or a refueling tray, a re-oiling bin that we fuel into and catch any drips or spills so that we can then get rid of them later.